In a world overflowing with blame, outrage, and noise, one moment stood out, not because of volume, but because of how quietly it cut through everything. What Bill Clinton did that night wasn't showmanship, it wasn't sarcasm, it wasn't cleverness for the sake of winning a point, it was composure. The kind of composure that strips away the room's pretenses and forces everyone to see the truth sitting right in front of them. The sun was lowering over Washington, D.C., melting into soft gold along the skyline as the National Leadership Forum prepared to begin. Inside, the chandeliers glowed like suspended stars, shimmering over polished tables and rows of high-profile guests dressed in their most diplomatic caution. It was meant to be a calm evening, handshakes, polite applause, curated optimism, but the minute two names appeared on the program, Bill Clinton and Melania Trump, every advisor, journalist, and strategist in the room sensed the shift in the air. This wasn't just another forum anymore. This was the beginning of a collision. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. Melania entered first. Her presence was unmistakable. Graceful posture, soft smile, steps that clicked rhythmically across marble like a metronome of confidence. Cameras lit up instantly, whispered speculation followed behind her like a shadow. Clinton arrived minutes later, wearing that practiced, easy charm. Calm eyes, relaxed shoulders. The kind of expression that told the room he had seen chaos before and knew how to remain steady through it. Their greeting was polite, just a nod and a handshake. But even that tiny exchange felt like the quiet meeting of two rivers destined to clash. Name cards gleamed on the long navy-draped table, senators, diplomats, philanthropists, and side by side, Melania Trump and Bill Clinton. People shifted in their seats, pretending not to stare. Photographers angled themselves toward them, waiting, hoping. The electricity of anticipation hummed beneath every breath, and nobody, not a single person, expected the moment that would ignite the room. The host stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich and welcoming, "tonight we gather the minds that have shaped modern America." Polite applause followed each name until the host announced the opening speaker. "Our first address will be given by the former First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Melania Trump." The applause swelled. Cameras snapped upward. Melania rose gracefully, her face calm but her heart beat a quiet drum beneath her composure. Clinton watched her with full attention. No notes, no phone, no distractions. When she reached the podium, her voice carried the elegance she was known for. Steady, beautifully controlled, warm in all the right places. She began with unity, leadership, responsibility, the usual themes, at least at first. But then her tone shifted. "Today," she said, leaning into the microphone, "our country faces very serious problems created by failures of leadership." That line froze the hall. People exchanged looks. Clinton remained still, hands folded, expression unreadable. Melania continued. "Inflation, rising costs, struggling families." Then, with a carefully measured pause, she delivered the first strike. These issues did not appear overnight. They were created by decisions, wrong decisions, from leaders who cared more about speeches than results. The words hung in the air like fog. She didn't name anyone. She didn't have to. Every head turned slightly toward Clinton. And then she crossed a line, deliberately revisiting an old sensitive question about whether a former president had really been born in America. A jab from the past. A conspiracy dragged back into the light. The room rippled. Awkward coughs, soft gasps. A woman in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Melania's voice remained smooth, but her message had turned sharp. It wasn't political anymore. It was personal. Clinton didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't react. His calmness felt like pressure, quiet, heavy, intentional. When Melania finished, the applause was polite but strained. She returned to her seat beside Clinton, her face serene, though her pulse raced beneath her skin. Clinton gave her a small nod. Not approval, not agreement, just acknowledgement. And the entire room felt it. He had heard every word. He just wasn't ready to answer. "Not yet," the whispers began immediately. "Did she really say that? Is he going to respond? What's Clinton going to do?" Because his turn was next, and history had shown. When Bill Clinton finally spoke, he never missed the moment. The applause for Melania's speech faded into an uneasy silence that pressed against the walls like thick fog. It wasn't the warmth of admiration, nor the satisfied applause of agreement. It was the sound people make when they aren't sure whether to clap or hold their breath. Melania sat down gracefully, folding her hands in her lap, but her fingers betrayed her, tapping once, twice, 3 times against the table. Inside, tension swirled like a quiet storm. Across from her, Bill Clinton remained still, perfectly still, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, but his eyes, they were sharp, focused, studying, listening, not a flicker of irritation, not a single sign of being rattled, and yet that silence, his silence, felt heavier than any verbal rebuttal. The host, sensing tension he hadn't prepared for, tried to smooth the evening forward. "Thank you, Mrs. Trump," he said, clearing his throat with a nervous smile. "That was, very insightful." But the audience wasn't moving on, not mentally, not emotionally. Whispers filled the room like wind through dry grass. Did she just bring that up again? She really said it to his face? What's Clinton going to do? A woman leaned toward her husband in the second row. "Did she mean him?" she whispered. Her husband nodded. "Oh, she definitely did." Everyone knew exactly what had just happened. Melania hadn't merely spoken about inflation or leadership. She had unearthed an old wound, questioning whether a former president had truly been American-born. The same rumor that once swept the nation, fueled headlines and filled rallies with controversy, and now, years later, she had revived it again, right in front of Bill Clinton. Melania lifted her chin a little higher. She didn't look regretful. If anything, she looked proud. She believed she had spoken her truth boldly, unafraid of the consequences. In the press section, a journalist angled his camera toward Clinton, waiting for the tiniest reaction. Another scribbled in his notebook, trying not to draw attention to himself. Every person with a pen or camera was holding on to one question. How is Bill Clinton going to respond? But Clinton didn't react. Not yet. He simply lowered his gaze for a moment, perhaps gathering his thoughts, perhaps steadying his breath. Then he gave a faint, almost weary smile, a smile that said, "I've been here before. I know how this game works, and I'm not surprised." The host shuffled the cue cards in his hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "Next," he continued, "we will hear from our other distinguished guest." He hesitated, and the whole room felt it. "Former President Bill Clinton." A wave of murmurs rolled through the hall like a rising tide. This was clearly the moment everyone had been anticipating, the moment Clinton would respond, clarify, correct, diffuse, or explode. But before Clinton could stand, something happened, something explosive. A man in the audience rose from his seat. He was part of the open Q&A segment scheduled much later, but the timing couldn't have been worse or more dangerous. Holding a microphone, he addressed Melania directly. "Mrs. Trump," he said loudly, "you mentioned leadership failures being responsible for inflation and economic struggles. Are you saying former President Clinton is to blame for what Americans face today?" Gasps, whispers, a ripple of shock across the room. Every head snapped back toward Melania. For the first time, she hesitated. A fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but enough to betray that she hadn't expected to be put on the spot so directly. Then she lifted her chin again and replied, "Yes, I believe decisions made in the past are why people are suffering now. Some leaders cared more about image and speeches than real action." A cold draft seemed to sweep through the hall. She didn't name Clinton, but she drew the line so clearly that everyone could see exactly where it pointed. The journalist in the second row nearly dropped his pen. Another reporter shifted forward in his chair, waiting for the inevitable fallout. Melania's face remained composed, but her voice trembled slightly, just slightly. Perhaps nerves, perhaps the weight of what she was saying, calling out Bill Clinton, one of the most politically experienced figures alive, was not something done lightly. Clinton exhaled softly, not from anger, but from something closer to resignation, or perhaps amusement. He leaned back in his chair slightly, clasping his hands together with the relaxed ease of someone who knew the board far better than the opponent who thought they had cornered him. The host tried again to regain control. "Thank you, Mrs. Trump," he said quickly. "Now please welcome President Bill Clinton." This time the applause wasn't polite, it was thunderous, not because of political loyalty, not because of admiration, but because people were desperate to hear what he would say. Melania's confidence faltered, only a little, but enough to tighten her smile, enough to make her glance toward him, then away, as if fearing the storm she might have just summoned. Clinton rose slowly from his seat, calm, measured, every step deliberate, composed, the kind of movement that told the room he wasn't shaken in the slightest. He was preparing. As he passed Melania, he offered her a brief nod, respectful, but undeniably firm. He reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and then he didn't speak. Not for 5 seconds, not for 10, not for 20. He let the silence breathe, expand, transform the entire hall into a place of tension and anticipation. And then, with a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips, he finally spoke. "Well," he said softly, "that was quite a speech." Nervous laughter echoed across the room. Even Melania gave a thin, polite smile. But Clinton's eyes, calm, steady, didn't move away from her. "Truth," he said, "is an interesting thing, especially when it's spoken in a room full of people who already know it." The laughter vanished, the air tightened, and in that instant everyone understood. This was not going to be a polite rebuttal. This was going to be something else entirely. The room went still again, too still. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was anticipation, the heavy, breathless kind that settles moments before a storm breaks open. Bill Clinton stood behind the podium, one hand resting lightly on the microphone, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing steady. He didn't rush. He didn't force a smile. He simply observed the room, taking in every anxious face staring back at him. Then his gaze settled briefly on Melania. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Her confidence flickered. His calm deepened. He finally spoke again, this time with the quiet control of someone who had prepared his whole life for moments just like this. "Well," he repeated, "that was quite a speech." The crowd chuckled softly, unsure whether to laugh or brace themselves. Clinton let the sound wash over him like distant waves. "But before I begin," he continued, his voice warm but firm, "let me say this. Everyone in this room cares about this country. Every person here wants America to succeed. No matter what side we stand on, no matter what we believe, that is something we share." Heads nodded across the hall. Melania lowered her eyes for a moment, perhaps believing the tension would ease now, perhaps hoping he would take the high road. But Clinton wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, not aggressively but with meaning. "But caring about this country also means being honest. And honesty," he said, letting the word hang in the air, "can make people uncomfortable." A hush swept through the room. Clinton clasped his hands gently in front of him, his posture still perfectly composed. "It's interesting," he said thoughtfully, "how people like to talk about leadership, about truth, about responsibility." He paused, then added with a subtle shift in tone, "But it becomes even more interesting when the same people forget how those things actually work." He didn't look at Melania. He didn't need to. Everyone in the hall followed his gaze, even when it wasn't directed. Clinton continued, now with a faint trace of humor layered beneath the seriousness. "I remember a time," he said, "when folks questioned whether a president was even born in this country. I remember the headlines, the rallies, the interviews." The room stirred. Melania inhaled sharply. Clinton smiled, not smug, but knowing. "And many of those claims," he added, chuckling softly, "came from the same household represented here tonight." Laughter erupted, some genuine, some from sheer disbelief. A few gasps cut through the noise like small cracks in ice. Melania sat frozen, her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her heart pounded beneath her tailored jacket. Clinton let the room settle before delivering the next line, smooth as polished glass, yet sharp as a blade. "You see, it's very easy to question someone else's truth when you've never had to defend your own." That line hit the audience like a gust of cold wind. A camera zoomed in, guests exchanged uneasy glances, Melania's breathing quickened. Clinton wasn't raising his voice, he didn't have to. His composure carried more force than volume ever could. Then, just when the hall felt ready to combust, Clinton delivered the moment that would echo for years. He leaned in slightly, looked directly at Melania, and asked, "But before we go around questioning other people's identities, maybe we should be asking a different question." He paused, a full second, 2 seconds, 3. "Are you sure," he said slowly, clearly, "that you're really Trump's wife?" The gasp that exploded through the hall felt almost physical, like the air itself recoiled. Some laughed nervously, some clutched their pearls. Others stared with their mouths open, frozen in shock. Melania's eyes widened, her lips parted, but no words came out. Clinton didn't flinch. He simply held her gaze, his expression calm and unreadable. When Melania finally managed to speak, her voice cracked. That is not an appropriate question." Clinton tilted his head. "Oh, inappropriate," he repeated gently, as if tasting the word. "Interesting choice." A familiar spark lit behind his eyes, the same spark people remembered from his most decisive debate moments. "You know," he continued, "calling something inappropriate is easy, especially when the truth gets too close to home." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, unable to look away. Melania exhaled sharply, trying to regain her footing. "You are being disrespectful." Clinton's face remained calm, almost empathetic. "Disrespectful," he echoed softly. "No, calling out lies, that's not disrespect. But twisting stories, spreading rumors, and attacking others without reason, he paused, raising an eyebrow. Well, that's another conversation entirely. Melania swallowed hard. Clinton continued with steady, measured clarity. You talk about image, he said. About presence, about how leaders should look and speak. That's fine. But leadership, real leadership, comes from honesty, not from appearances. He swept his gaze across the room. And honesty, he said, means owning your truth, even when it inconveniences you. Every word landed with precision. Every pause sharpened the silence. Then Clinton turned back to Melania and delivered another line with quiet weight. And yes, he said, I understand how easy it is to throw around accusations, especially when the people you love were the ones who started the story in the first place. Melania stiffened. The implication hit her like a blow. Everyone in the room knew he was referring to Donald Trump's years of amplifying the birther conspiracy. The reminder felt like a slap in slow motion. Clinton leaned closer to the mic, lowered his voice. I've kept quiet about a lot of things, he said, but don't confuse silence with weakness. That line electrified the room. I've seen and heard more than most people realize, he added, and if I ever wanted to, I could show things that would make many people very uncomfortable. The hall froze. Reporters sat motionless. No camera light dared blink. Melania stared at him, the color draining from her face. What are you talking about? She whispered. Clinton adjusted his jacket lightly before speaking. Let's just say, he replied carefully, that before you question someone else's truth, you might want to make sure your own story doesn't have missing pages. The air tightened into a single held breath. Melania looked shaken now, unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to appear. Her hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. Clinton offered a small, warm smile. Anyway, he said lightly, let's get back to leadership. Soft laughter broke the tension, but the message had already been carved into the moment. The audience let out a soft wave of laughter at Clinton's last line, but it wasn't carefree. It was the uneasy laughter people use when they know a line just landed harder than they want to admit. Melania's smile had thinned. Her posture remained straight, but inside, the ground was shifting. She could feel it. The control she believed she had when she walked up to that podium was slipping through her fingers, piece by piece. Clinton glanced at his notes, but didn't look down for long. You mentioned leadership, he continued, his tone steady. How leaders present themselves, the speeches they give, the way they stand on stage, and that's all part of the job, sure. He gave a small shrug. But none of that means much without one thing, integrity. He said the word slowly, like he was placing it carefully in the center of the room. A leader's power, he went on, doesn't come from the suit they wear, or the lights on their face, or the cameras pointed at them. It comes from whether what they say matches what they do. It comes from being real, even when it's hard. He paused just long enough for the message to sink in. Real leadership, he added, means owning your truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. He scanned the room again, eyes moving steadily from table to table. No one spoke, no one moved. Every person in that hall felt like they were sitting in the front row of a lesson they hadn't realized they signed up for. Then he turned back toward Melania. And I understand, he said more softly, how easy it is to throw words around, especially when the story started close to home. It's easier to question someone else's identity than to acknowledge the damage done by the people you trust most. The implication was crystal clear. He was talking about her husband. He was talking about years of accusations and rumors that had been shouted from podiums, interviews, and rallies. Melania's throat tightened. She knew it, the audience knew it, the press definitely knew it. Clinton leaned toward the microphone, his tone lowering again. I've stayed quiet on a lot of things, he said. People took shots, they spun stories, they pushed lies, and I let a lot of it go, not because I was weak, but because I knew the truth would outlast the noise. A faint murmur rolled through the crowd. But don't ever mistake silence for weakness, he said, his gaze never wavering. I've seen and heard more than people realize, and if I ever wanted to, I could bring a lot of inconvenient truths into the light. The room felt like it stopped breathing all at once. Melania's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. What are you implying? She asked under her breath, though her mic picked up the tremor. Clinton didn't answer right away. He simply adjusted his jacket and continued calmly. Before you question someone else's truth, he said, make sure your own story doesn't have missing pages. That sentence landed like a gavel. For a moment nobody moved. Then there was a rustle of clothing, a flicking of cameras, the low crackle of whispered reactions. Melania looked shaken. Her carefully constructed composure was beginning to fracture. She took a sip of water, her hand trembling slightly. Clinton smiled again, soft, almost kind. "And now," he said, easing his voice back toward the topic the forum was actually created for, "let's get back to leadership, because our country needs less theater and more truth." Soft, relieved laughter moved through the audience, not because they were amused, but because they finally had a way to exhale the pressure building in the room. He shifted into his broader speech about unity, responsibility, economic reality, and the need for leaders to be honest about both mistakes and solutions. But no matter how smoothly he transitioned, everyone in that hall knew the real moment had already happened. His response to Melania wasn't a side note, it had become the centerpiece. When he finished, he closed with a simple line. "Respect isn't something you demand," he said. "It's something you earn, and you earn it by telling the truth, even when it costs you." The applause began slowly, then it grew, louder, stronger, more certain than anything they'd offered that night. Clinton stepped back from the podium and walked toward his seat, the clapping continuing around him. He didn't bask in it, didn't look triumphant. His expression was steady, almost somber. Melania stared straight ahead, listening to the applause that didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. As Clinton sat down, the clapping finally faded into a low jitter of whispers. Melania's heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. Then something inside her snapped. She pushed her chair back and stood up. The sharp scrape of the chair against the floor cut clean through the noise. Every head in the hall turned instantly. "Mr. Clinton!" she called out, her voice shaking but loud enough to fill the room. He turned slowly, looking up at her with that same calm expression. Melania's eyes burned, her chest tight. "You have no right to talk to me that way," she said. "I have always supported this country. I have always represented dignity." The room froze. Even the host, halfway through preparing to move to the next segment, froze with his cue cards in hand. Clinton stayed seated for a second longer, then rose again, not rushed, not irritated. He walked back to the microphone, his eyes still on her. "Dignity," he repeated gently. "You're right, it matters." He reached the podium again. "And that's exactly why it's dangerous to play with lies," he said. "Because every time someone twists the truth, they're not just targeting the person in the story, they're hurting the people who trust them, their supporters, their families, their country." The hall hummed with tension again. "Before we continue, if you were in Melania Trump's shoes in this moment, called out in front of the whole world after taking that kind of shot, what would you do? Would you double down, or would you walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know how you'd handle a moment like this." Melania's breath quickened. "You are trying to humiliate me in front of everyone," she said, her accent sharpening along with her anger. Clinton shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "I'm reminding everyone what happens when people throw stones and forget they live in glass houses." A ripple of gasps spread across the room. Someone in the back muttered, "Wow," under their breath. Melania's lips trembled. "You think you're clever," she shot back. "You think your words can cover the failures you left behind. Inflation, high costs, broken promises. This is your legacy." Clinton's smile faded. His eyes hardened slightly, not cruel, but laser-focused. "Interesting," he said softly. "Because last I checked, the people running the show in 2025 aren't exactly using my name on their signs." A few people clapped, more by reflex than intention. Melania's face flushed. "You are always blaming others," she said bitterly. "Always playing the victim." Clinton leaned closer to the mic. "Victim?" he said quietly. "No, Melania, I'm not the one who built a political machine by attacking other people's identity. I'm not the one who turned where someone was born into a weapon." He paused. "That didn't come from me," he said. "That came from your own house." The silence afterward felt endless. The room was holding its breath now. Melania's hands shook slightly as she tried to respond. You don't know what you're talking about," she managed. Clinton didn't look away. "Actually," he said calmly, "I do." He let that hang for a second before continuing. "When those rumors were spread about that former president's birth certificate, I watched. I watched the interviews, the rallies, the headlines, the smirks. I watched people act like truth was optional, like it was some costume you could put on or take off depending on who you liked." His voice never rose. If anything, it softened. "And I stayed quiet," he admitted, "because I had the facts, the truth, the records. I didn't need to shout." He straightened slightly. "But maybe," he said slowly, "maybe it's time other people learn how truth feels when it comes back to their doorstep." Melania's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" she demanded. Clinton's gaze didn't waver. "Let's just say," he replied, "there are documents, things I've seen, that would make your husband's public image look very different." The hall tensed again. Every journalist in the room sat forward, every camera locked in. "You wouldn't dare," Melania whispered. Clinton gave a small, almost sad smile. "I don't have to," he said, "because people already know enough to see what's wrong." He leaned a little closer to the microphone. "And maybe," he added, "if the truth came out about how much influence you really had in that White House, people would start asking different questions." Melania's lips parted in shock. "You're threatening me," he shook his head once. "No, Melania," he replied. "I'm warning you, when you try to drag others down with lies, sometimes the truth doesn't just sit quietly, sometimes it fights back." The tension in the room was unbearable now. Even the host looked lost, his carefully planned program reduced to a stack of useless cue cards in his hands. Then Clinton said one last thing, softly, almost like a private aside, but every microphone caught it. "Tell your husband," he said, "that if he wants to keep pretending, he should remember who actually has the proof." Melania's jaw dropped. He continued before she could speak. "And just so we're clear," he added, his tone now almost clinical, "I don't need to show anyone anything. People already see what's wrong. Every time your husband talks about his own daughter." The audience reacted like they'd been physically struck. Low gasps whispered, "Oh my God!" A couple of people covered their mouths. Everyone knew exactly what he was referencing, those old comments Trump had made that never truly faded from public memory. Melania's face went pale. She reached for her glass of water with trembling fingers, the ice clinking sharply against the sides as she brought it to her lips. Clinton stepped back from the podium. "I think my time is done here," he said quietly. He gave a small nod to the host, then turned and walked off the stage. No fist pump. No grin, no dramatic gesture, just calm, steady steps toward the exit. The audience didn't know what to do. Some people began to stand, some clapped uncertainly. Others just stared, their minds scrambling to process what they had just witnessed. Melania stayed seated, her eyes fixed on the now empty stage. The woman who had walked up there earlier, confident and composed, believing she would reshape the narrative, now sat in stunned silence. The words she had launched at him had come back with a weight she hadn't expected. The host finally stepped forward, forcing a stiff smile. "Thank you, President Clinton," he said awkwardly, "and thank you, Mrs. Trump." But the mood in the room couldn't be repaired. Not tonight. The program went on, but no one was listening to the next speaker. People were still replaying the clash in their minds, whispering, speculating, reacting. They knew something monumental had just happened, not because of headline drama, but because they had seen, right in front of them, what happens when composure meets pride. And composure wins. While the hall struggled to return to normal, Bill Clinton was already outside, walking down a quiet side corridor lit by soft yellow lights. His footsteps echoed faintly against polished stone. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't triumphant. His expression was thoughtful, a little heavy. One of his aides walked beside him, hesitant. "You handled that well, sir," the aide said carefully. Clinton exhaled slowly, looking toward the darkened windows where faint reflections of the city lights shimmered. "That could have gone better," he murmured. The aide frowned. "You were calm, honest. You didn't lose your temper." Clinton nodded, still staring ahead. "I didn't want to hurt her," he said quietly. "I just wanted the truth to land where it needed to." He paused, then added in a softer tone, "You can't build anything solid on falsehoods. They might stand for a while, but eventually they crumble under their own weight." Back inside, Melania finally rose from her seat. The once flattering stage lights now felt harsh, unforgiving. Every shadow, every whisper seemed to cling to her as she walked. She passed a mirror near the exit and stopped. For the first time that evening, there were no cameras, no smiles, no performance. Just her reflection. Eyes tired, face pale, shoulders slightly slumped. She stared at herself for a long moment. "Why did I say so much?" she whispered in a barely audible voice. There was no answer. She straightened her jacket, took a breath, and walked out of the hall, leaving behind the echo of a night that would follow her for a long time. In the days that followed, the story spread. Clips from the event were replayed on news channels, podcasts, social media. People argued over it. Some defended Melania, others praised Clinton, and many just watched, stunned by how raw and human it had all felt. But for those who were actually in that room, one thing stood out above the noise: the contrast. Clinton's calm versus Melania's volatility, composure versus wounded pride, truth that stood still versus accusations that crumbled under pressure. A few weeks later, Clinton sat down for a small, intimate interview. The host asked him what he hoped people would remember from that tense night. He smiled faintly and said, "Grace under pressure, that's all." The interviewer tilted her head. "Do you think you went too far?" She asked. Clinton thought about it for a moment. No, he answered, because it wasn't about winning an argument. It was about showing people that dignity still matters. You can defend yourself, you can push back, but if you lose your composure, you lose more than just the debate. You lose your voice. He leaned back slightly, that familiar half-grin flickering for a moment. And sometimes, he added, silence teaches louder than shouting ever could. Meanwhile, Melania stayed out of the spotlight for a while. Those who were close to her said she seemed quieter, more reflective. She focused on her charity projects, limited her appearances, and avoided public fights. She didn't talk about that night, not in public and rarely in private, but something had shifted. She had learned, in the hardest way, how a single moment of pride could unravel the image she tried so carefully to protect. Months later, they crossed paths again at another major event. Different city, different hall, calmer air. Clinton saw her from across the room and gave a small nod. She returned it, polite, distant, reserved. No speeches this time, no confrontation, just two people who had once stood in the eye of a public storm, now simply existing under the same quiet ceiling. For you, watching this story now, there's a lesson here that goes deeper than politics, deeper than one party or another. It's about what survives after the shouting stops. Before we continue to the end, if there was a moment in this story that hit you the hardest, Melania's pride, Clinton's composure, or that one line that changed everything, share it in the comments and tell us why it stood out to you. And if any revelation in this story truly shocked you, type truth in the comments so we know you felt it. Because in a world where everyone is trying to speak louder, sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that stays steady. Clinton showed that night that leadership isn't measured by volume or applause, it's measured by control, by empathy, by the ability to stay grounded when everything around you starts to shake, and Melania's silence, in the end, carried its own meaning. Sometimes silence is defeat, sometimes it's reflection, sometimes it's the moment when you realize the truth wasn't on your side, and you have to live with what you said anyway. As the lights in that grand hall finally went out and the cameras were packed away, one message lingered in the air. Respect is not demanded, it's earned. Truth doesn't shout, it stands. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. Stories like this aren't just about famous names or political titles. They're about what we, as people, choose when we're under pressure, pride or humility, noise or truth. If Melania and Clinton's clash made you think about how you handle conflict, or how easily words can turn into weapons, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like this video if you believe composure still matters in a loud world. Comment below with the moment that hit you the hardest. I read every single one. And share this story with someone who loves powerful, real human moments behind the headlines. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them.